Here I am at the top of Crown Mountain. There are a lot of reasons why a person might want to climb a mountain. One of the less attractive to my mind is called peak bagging. It's a competitive challenge to see how many peaks in a given area you can get to the top of. But that expression, peak bagging, makes it out as if you're the hunter and the mountains are your prey. But I don't think mountains are things you ought to try to conquer. They're things you should have reverence for. The ecofeminist thinker Val Plumwood says that this logic of domination is present both in patriarchal gender relations and in the prevailing way in which we relate to the environment. Reconfiguring the way that we relate both to one another within society and to the environment around us is a steep hill to climb. But if we can make it work, it might afford all sorts of new perspectives.
Val Plumwood, who died in 2008, was one of the foremost thinkers in what is known as ecofeminist philosophy. Now, the basic idea behind ecofeminist philosophy is that they want to analyze and to challenge gender-based oppression and the human domination of nature, and to show that these two things, the gender-based oppression and the human domination of nature, both grow from the same root. And according to Plumwood, that common root is what she calls rationalism. The idea not simply that human beings are rational, Plumwood herself uses a lot of very carefully reasoned arguments to build her case, but that our reason on one hand sets us apart from the rest of nature, and second, makes us superior to the rest of nature. And so there's a hierarchy where reason is not just one trait among many that human beings have, but the most important one, and the most important one because it makes us better than everything else. And as Plumwood analyzes it, this rationalism is supported by a series of mutually reinforcing dualisms. So on one hand, you've got this dualism between the human and the natural, where we are superior to the rest of nature, and we're superior, at least in part, because of our rational capacities. And reason is often then contrasted with emotion. And you can see how the reason-emotion contrast then has a gendered element, where reason is often gendered as masculine, emotion is gendered as feminine, and there's a whole series of other mutually reinforcing dualisms here. The masculine reason takes place in public settings, whereas feminine emotion belongs in the private setting, and so on and so forth. And so the thought then is that you have this whole logic of dualisms that sets up the human as superior to the natural, but also sets up the masculine as what is most distinctively human, the most different from the rest of nature, whereas feminine emotion and all of the rest is associated with our bodily aspects, our sexuality and reproducibility, all of which associate us more with nature and so are more or less distinctively human, according to the kinds of dualisms that rationality supports itself with. Now, Plumwood sees this kind of rationalism at work in a lot of other forms of environmental thinking. And in particular, she targets ethical universalism and deep ecology. And I'll say a little bit about both of these in turn. Ethical universalism is the idea that we should extend our ethical concern to the widest possible domain. And you see this already in the idea of human rights. So the idea behind human rights is the idea that all people are equal and all people are equally deserving of moral consideration. And historically speaking, these sorts of arguments about universal equality among human beings has had an important role to play in giving equal rights to women, overcoming colonization and racial oppression, and various other things. And there have been various movements to extend this sort of rights-based thinking to other animals and to the rest of nature more broadly. So animal rights arguments will often draw on the idea that in all relevant respects, all morally relevant respects, animals are, or at least many animals, are equivalent to humans in their capacity for suffering, their capacity to have good or bad experiences, and so on and so forth. And so we should expand our moral concern outward to include other animals. Other thinkers have thought that we need to expand our concern even further to include all life forms, or perhaps the ecosystem as a whole. But Plumwood thinks this kind of thinking is ultimately rooted in a problematic rationalism. So a lot of this universalist thinking whether in the human rights sphere or in the environmental ethics that have included animals and other aspects of nature, argue that a proper ethics should be one that is based in reason and not in emotion. The thought is that our emotions and our particular partial concerns for those we care about all distract us from being objective judges of the moral situation. And so we need to bracket all of our particular loyalties and concerns in order to think impartially and without bias about who ought to fall under moral concern. And Plumwood's concern there is that this sort of argument is part of the rationalism that she sees as celebrating the powers of reason and downgrading emotion that have also been at work in a lot of gender-based oppression that genders women as emotional and therefore not capable of fully participating in reason. And she argues that this sort of logic that values objective, rational, public thinking is part of a logic that has always been a part of the human conception of human beings as superior to nature. And so it's just not an appropriate form of ethical reflection if we want to include non-human animals and other elements of the natural environment in our moral concern. Deep ecology is a movement that, like ecofeminism, really came into its own in the 1970s. And during that time, ecofeminists and deep ecologists often saw themselves as working in a similar vein, that both of them wanted to challenge certain fundamental assumptions about the superiority of human beings over nature or even their distinctness from nature. Now, the way that deep ecologists tend to do this is by trying to expand our conception of what is a self. That they argue that there is something limited and cloistered about thinking of ourselves as these isolated individuals. And they call on us to expand our conception of ourselves so that we see ourselves as part of some greater self, that we are one with nature, and the natural world isn't different from us or distinct from us, but that we are part of that world, and that properly understood, we would understand ourselves as part of this bigger self. And it's this idea of identifying with the rest of nature that ecofeminist philosophers like Plumwood started to take issue with. And in the 1980s and 1990s, there was a split that came to be known as the deep ecology ecofeminist debate, and Plumwood was definitely one of the more vigorous figures on the ecofeminist side. And her thinking is, first of all, that this notion of expanding our conception of self to identify with all of nature, again, recapitulates some of this universalist thinking that she finds problematic in ethical universalism, but also that it makes no space for a relatedness to others. That she thinks that a proper ethical concern is where I recognize the needs of other beings, but recognize those beings as other from me. That she sees deep ecology as recapitulating a form of rational egoism that starts with the default assumption that our basic setting is one of self-interest, and that caring about others requires some kind of self-sacrifice so that we can overcome our self-interest in order to care about others. But the deep ecology response to that is just to expand the conception of the self so that this self that is self-interested can include all of nature rather than just my own individual personal preferences. But she thinks that this problem is centrally with the idea of rational egoism as a default setting, that she thinks it's simply not true as a matter of psychological fact, that we are often concerned for others in ways that don't come back to our own self-interest, but also that it's morally problematic, that we don't formulate an ethics that is based on caring for others as others. Plumwood's proposed alternative to ethical universalism and deep ecology involves a conception of the self that she characterizes as self in relationship. And her thinking really emerges from this critique of these more universalist ways of thinking. That to the extent that they are gendered as masculine, that they prize the objective and the universal and the rational over the personal, the private, the emotional. She wants us to recognize that those more personal aspects of ourselves are very much a part of who we are. That as a human being, I am not simply a rational mind. I am also an emotional being that engages with the world in a sensory way, that has sexual and reproductive interests, and so on and so forth. And if we're going to think about our ethical being in these terms, we no longer need to bracket all our personal considerations, but rather to recognize how our personal loyalties and concerns inform our broader concern for nature as a whole. So Plumwood doesn't want us to ditch our personal loyalties. In fact, she wants to base her ethics on a conception of care, where I might care for particular other people, particular other animals, particular trees, particular landscapes, and to recognize that it's in those particular loyalties, those very personal forms of caring, that we start to develop an idea of what it means to be in relationship with others. And again, this notion of others is an important contrast to the idea of the expanded self that you find in deep ecology. That the way that she thinks of this idea of being related to others is one where we recognize that our own interests are essentially tied to the interests of others. So, for example, she gives the example of a mother caring for her child, that it's not in the mother's selfish interest that the child flourish. The child's own interests are part of what are essential to the mother's interests. So, contrary to the idea of rational egoism, we aren't just a bunch of selfish individuals looking out for ourselves who have to overcome that selfishness somehow through ethical, rational reflection, but rather we are all already beings that care about things beyond ourselves. And it's by recognizing ourselves as caring beings, as beings that exist in relationships with others, that we can start to recognize the demands that are placed upon us, not just by those who are closest to us, but also by, more broadly speaking, aspects of the natural world that we don't have any personal connection to.